Hey guys, it's John Michael, the Strega Mystica, and I wanted to talk to you today about something that's a frequent question I get. I've often been asked why I go out of my way to establish that I'm not remotely connected to the pop culture neo-pagan movement. And so I want folks to understand that when I do that, when I say that it's important for people to understand the distinction, I'm not in any way condemning or criticizing those for whom the neo-pagan movement is the source of their spiritual practice. And I know that it can be confusing for some because so much of what we find on the most popular social media channels have, for the sake of building an audience or monetizing that content, done remarkable injustices to the prospects for seekers to actually understand the difference between folk magic and witchcraft and the 20th century world of make-believe white privilege that is so much of what gets labeled as neo-paganism. Simply throwing a do-rag on your head and pretending or playing the tarantella in the background doesn't make you a folk magic practitioner, especially if you're pretending to be an Italian or a Sicilian folk magic practitioner. If you're talking about things like worshiping Athena or Diana or Hecate, and pretending that those are part of Italian or Sicilian folk magic traditions, you're a con artist. You're not telling the truth. And you're just providing your audience with what they want. And I'm not going to pretend that that's anything other than the facts. Second, there's a distinction between Italian and Afro-Sicilian folk magic or folk Catholicism, which those very same folks with the do-rags and the tarantella seem to fail to grasp. The term folk magic encompasses a wide variety of diverse magical practices influenced by the culture, the political climate, and the specific needs of a particular region of people. There's no codified or doctrinal foundation in folk magic. There's no dogma that says this is how you do it, which means that a particular type of folk magic is unified only by its mutuality with the common folk. That's why it's called folk magic. That's why we see some people claiming to be practitioners of Catholic folk magic who are not really practicing anything that remotely resembles the folk Catholicism of Central or South America, Europe, or the Middle East. And while I would suggest that many of those practitioners monetizing their social media by claiming to be Catholic folk magic practitioners don't have the foggiest clue what actual Catholic folk magic looks like, it's not a big deal. Sure, those whose families are established practitioners of Catholic folk magic consider these pop culture practitioners to be absurd, to be clueless, and frankly, to be a laughingstock. But if it gives them solace, if it brings purpose to them and a sense of validation that so many of them seem so desperate and hungry to achieve, that's really the harm. So why then do I make a point of saying that the practices I've engaged for the past 54 years as an Afro-Sicilian folk magic practitioner and an Indo-European Catholic folk magic practitioner has nothing in common with neo-paganism? Well, as I've often said, I have nothing against neo-paganism. I scoff at the pretense of those who are in the minority who claim that neo-paganism has any roots in ancient Italy or Etruria or Greece or the Celtic world, because that's patently false and has been easily proven so. There was no such thing as paganism in the ancient world. There were folk religions, cults of various deities, mystery schools, none of which had anything to do with so-called witchcraft. And of course, there were folk magic practitioners, healers, psychics, visionaries, conjure workers, none of whom were directly linked to religion in the ancient world or witchcraft, but with whom there would be clearly some intersectionality with practitioners of the various ancient religions. Many folk magic practitioners would have likely been practitioners of ancient religions as well. So neo-paganism is a product of white privileged patriarchy created in the mid-20th century, period. It's a 20th century religion, much like Mormonism or the Latter-day Saints is a 19th century religion. And I believe that it deserves, neo-paganism deserves as much or as little respect as any religion, because the same repressive, dogmatic, manipulative, and from my perspective, absurdly theistic tenets, primitive mindsets lie at the heart of most forms of neo-paganism, with the notable exception of neo-druidry, as we find in the Abrahamic religions. Folk magic, much like druidry, is of a practical and organic nature. It's meant to address the common ills of a person's culture: fighting against depression, healing the sick, averting adverse energies or attacks, and restoring vitality to the land and to its people. It's about coming back into your own power. So I bristle when I hear people who have never actually been Catholic pretend to be Catholic folk magic practitioners, which is an impossibility, who pretend even more disgracefully that there's little difference between Catholic folk magic and Italian or Afro-Sicilian folk magic, because that's not true. There is, again, intersectionality, but the blending of the two, of Italian and Southern Italian and Afro-Sicilian folk magic and folk Catholicism, is an Italian-American phenomenon, an innovation that began in the early 20th century. And it began, like all folk magic, as a response to the oppression that Southern Italians and Afro-Sicilians were experiencing in that period of time when they came here from the old country. Guys, I believe everyone, without exception, has a right to express their spiritual practice in a way that resonates for them, period. And I go out of my way to defend and encourage that, and I always will. But I also refuse to let people's egomania and ignorance contribute to misinformation and disinformation about the subjects I've spent my entire life as a practitioner and an anthropologist studying. So that's why you get these occasional videos. And let me be clear, I have always welcomed discussion, debate, and exploration with those who find themselves feeling like I've somehow questioned the veracity of their claims. There's no shortage of podcasts out there that I have welcomed the opportunity to be on their show. Unsurprisingly, the folks who are probably the most responsible for the disinformation and misinformation don't want to have those conversations. And we all know why.